All right, well, I've got 2 minutes after the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks, everyone in the audience, for dialing in. This is the final edition of our short-run series here at the Yale Center for Business and the Environment on ecosystem services. And today's presentation is titled An Investor's Perspective. And before I get to our presenter and the presentation, just a couple of housekeeping items. Per usual, throughout the presentation, as questions come to you, please feel free to submit them in the questions box in your toolbar, and they will be posed out loud to the presenter during the second half of the program during the question and answer. And I want to mention, too, that this event, just like the previous two webinars, will be recorded, and any day now we'll have the three all posted and available online, publicly available. It takes a little while to process. I'm learning at Yale Digital Media Services, but we're working on it, and so I'll circulate an email with all of the recordings as soon as possible, definitely before I leave for the summer. That's a promise. So without further ado, I want to introduce today's presenter, Cliff Sunda, who is the resident forester at Working Lands Investment Partners. And Cliff joined Working Lands in 2008 after working as a consulting forester and wildland firefighter across the United States. He specializes in many aspects of natural resource management, including resource assessment and planning, remote sensing, growth and yield modeling, and carbon accounting. Cliff is a member of the Society of American Foresters and holds a BSF in Forest Management from Stephen F. Austin State University, and he's also currently a Master of Forestry candidate at SFA, where he's specializing in land use economics and spatial science. So at this point, I'd like to hand over the reins to Cliff, who's going to give us a presentation for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll be going to the audience Q&A. So Cliff, take it away.
Thanks, Tommy. Thanks for letting me come. Hopefully y'all leave here today with a little bit more information than when you started. I know previously the first speaker was Kay Hamilton with Ecosystem Marketplace. She kind of provided an overview of what ecosystem services are and the opportunities to generate revenue from those. Talked a little bit about domestically and internationally, what those opportunities are. Then Sheila Walsh from the Nature Conservancy gave an NGO's perspective and talked about the work they were doing domestically and internationally, mainly about water funds, and then some of the work she was doing with large commercial enterprises in the U.S. Today I'm going to kind of shift gears and talk from the perspective of investing in ecosystem service markets just in the United States. Most of the work I do involves regulatory markets for wetlands, streams, and habitat species, biodiversity. So these are things that have kind of defined service areas and trading units that I'll talk about a little bit. I'll talk a little bit more about WIP in a second, but pretty much what I do, I'm trained as a forester. I'm from East Texas. I have a background in forestry and agriculture. I grew up managing timberland and actually a blueberry operation. So working on the ground and kind of getting the hands dirty is my background. And I actually, when I joined WIP, it was to work on this a master's in forest economics. So what brought me to WIP was my master's degree, which I still haven't finished, but we're working towards that. So what my role at WIP has grown to pretty much I manage all the operations, the day-to-day contracting, planning, and design of any of our projects once we've acquired them. I also do all the assist with the data analysis, due diligence, any of the forecasting or just resource assessments associated with trying to develop new projects, and then also provide all the technical assistance for all of our credit sales when they occur. So like I said before, most of my time spent working on developing and executing projects and sales in a regulatory market environment. So it might be a little bit different than when we're talking about some of these other things that really have a hard time. People have a hard time assigning an actual value to them. These are more the value associated with the credit, I'll call it. It has to do with like opportunity costs and time, and it's pretty easy to put a value to that credit then. The other thing to think about is that when I'm working in this market, your customer actually, to some extent, has an obligation to participate in the market because they're usually trying to obtain a permit or some sort of authorization to carry out some sort of activity. Now, WIP is just one of a number of investment management firms that their objective is to generate superior returns for clients by investing in these growing environmental markets for a number of things. I've included some of the main ones here: wetland and stream mitigation credits, habitat banking, water quality and quantity, and carbon. And one of the main things here to think about is that one of the main objectives is to supplement returns with traditional income from timber management, recreation, and limited development. And when you combine all these things together, you end up with something that has long-term growth potential. It has a lower correlation to other different types of assets, and it's able to have consistent cash flow generation, especially from early on in the project, which is fairly critical. This graph is mainly just a conceptual graph. I just kind of pulled it together just to explain a few different things, to explain why the timing that a company like WIP would participate in a market is pretty critical, because you don't want to jump in too early. Let's say with like a more emerging market like water quality or carbon, until it has to some extent a little bit of a track record, because you run the risk of having things change, the regulations change, or just some of the units and all, and what you end up with is pretty inefficient then, and you run a high risk of generating lower returns. But over time, as a track record's established, usually we see the opportunity for higher returns grow significantly. And what will happen, probably an example of this I would say would be stream mitigation, stream restoration in certain parts of the country, where now, since the 2008 mitigation rule from the Corps of Engineers and the EPA, there's increased focus to making sure that impacts to aquatic resources are mitigated in kind. So stream restoration is kind of a higher cost, higher risk endeavor compared to like a wetland restoration or enhancement. So there aren't as many stream banks, and as a result, they're following the same regulatory framework as previously as the wetland market. So there's a little bit, the structure of the market's a little more sound, so you have the opportunity to generate some higher returns earlier on. But over time, as more supply comes online and the markets become more efficient, there's more supply, and so as you would imagine, returns are going to deflate. The landowners become more educated as to the potential value of their land, so land prices will probably rise accordingly. And over time, it'll settle out in some sort of long-term trajectory that probably would be above what you would have gotten if you just managed for traditional returns, such as some form of agriculture or timber management. Environmental markets altogether are probably going to be more risky than traditional markets, especially early on, and I just illustrated that with the kind of the downward sloping reverse J curve for environmental service risk. What is a unit? That's kind of a moving target. Generally, what I'm going to be talking about is a credit, but a credit could be a lot of different things. If you're talking about wetlands or streams, it might be a function of acres or feet, but that's changed now to more of a functional, conditional assessment of what is the quality of that acre or foot, not necessarily like a qualitative assessment of, well, it looks pretty good, or that's a high quality wetland, that's a low-quality wetland. We now have models that we can run, simple models in the field that give us a more quantitative assessment as to what the function is of that. It's still called a credit. It's just derived a little bit differently, and the math behind it's a little bit different. Biodiversity is kind of a different kind of animal. You're either looking with actual population numbers, breeding pairs, or acres of certain habitat or potential habitat for certain plants. Water quality is going to be pounds of pollutants. Could be talking in temperature in certain parts of the country, runoff, and then carbon, of course, is metric tons of CO2 equivalent. One thing to think about, just like an example of a credit within East Texas, let's say where I'm at right now. It's a pretty growing wetland mitigation market right now, and at this point we have about 3 different vintages, I would say, of projects. You have projects that were put in the late 90s, the pre-rural projects from the early 2000s, and then projects that have been permitted in the last couple of years. Each 3 of those categories has a different kind of credit, more or less. People will call you on the phone and they need credits to mitigate X amount of acres for a project, but technically, if you called an older bank, let's say TxDOT, Department of Transportation, has a bank, and if you impact 1 acre of land, you would need to buy 7 credits for a high-quality impact from them, versus if you went to a post-rural bank, a bank that was put in about 2 years ago, you might only need to buy, for 1 acre of high-quality, 3 credits from them. And if you use the latest assessment method, you might only need to buy 1 credit from a newer bank. And all that's really changing is that the ratio associated with that quality is kind of being transferred over to the banker, whereas now when I permit let's say 1,000-acre bank and it takes me 5 acres to generate a credit, that's all determined using these functional models. So I guess long story short, what I'm trying to illustrate is that the definition of these units can change over time, even within an individual market. It's something you have to keep in mind. The market boundaries are also a moving target, and they vary between the markets. You could be dealing with something like carbon, of course, which is you're talking like state level, national, global level. You do a project one place, well, that can directly impact something somewhere else. But when you're talking about smaller things like biodiversity or water quality, you really have to tighten up the service area associated with the restoration your project's doing, and how far out can that reach and be able to offset an impact somewhere else. Pretty much the going rate we look at is what's called the hydrologic unit code. It's an 8-digit unit. It's generally about the size of a few different counties, if that'll give you an idea. And it's a sub-watershed of a larger river basin. And that is generally what we see for most water quality or aquatic resource related projects, that's kind of like your standard service level. Now you can reach outside of that usually, but there's going to be some sort of multiplier assigned to that to account for that increased distance of reaching out. So I might be able to sell downstream for an impact that occurs downstream. They might be able to purchase credits from me, but they'll have to buy more credits because they're further away. With biodiversity, it can be a little bit different, because then you're talking about endangered species, you're talking about critical habitat, breeding acreage, or usually what I think of as genetically unique populations. I actually worked on a project on the East Coast where we were dealing with a certain species, and the landowner that we were working with wanted us to advise them on the potential. They were basically improving the habitat for bobwhite quail, but noticed that within 6 months of the work they were doing that a lot of these endangered species, red-cockaded woodpeckers, were coming onto their property because the habitat was so good. And he was just trying to decide, the landowner was trying to decide what, if this was an opportunity for him or if this was something he needed to be worried about. Well, it sounded like a good opportunity, so we dug around and we actually had a potential customer or potential entity that needed to offset some impacts to red-cockaded woodpeckers. But once you got down to it and you looked, their project was only 40 or 50 miles away, their impact site, which geographically wasn't that far away. But the fact of the matter is that there was a large river separating us, and that large river, the regulatory agencies felt like probably separated the two populations of woodpeckers between them, that genetically they were unique populations on either side, and so the opportunity to offset an impact wouldn't be there for them because it was kind of apples and oranges at that point. The population they were more concerned about wasn't the one that we were part of. But that's not to say that the resource agency certainly thought that it was a workable deal, but we would have to go through the steps to justify or prove that they were genetically connected populations, and that in itself would have been probably a couple of PhD dissertations to get it figured out, so it wasn't something we could have pursued. But that just goes to show how biodiversity is kind of a different kind of animal from some of these other things. And I like this slide. It just shows why banking works. Well, pretty much it just streamlines the permitting process for the permittee, because he's looking at the individual that needs a permit. To get one, usually if you're talking about a 404 permit from the Corps of Engineers, could be a 12 to 18 month endeavor for an individual permit. It could take quite a while. So anything you can do to minimize that time spent getting your permit is extremely beneficial. And what shows on the right side there, that's the steps you'd have to take if you're going to utilize a mitigation bank, versus the other side just shows all these other steps you're going to have to go through if you're going to try and do your own mitigation on-site or near-site, or justify that you don't need to do mitigation. So usually what we see is that the more important it is for a permittee to get their project approved more quickly, those are the folks that are going to be the ones that greatly embrace the banking concept. Because the good thing about the bank is it's already gone through the headache and the process of being approved by the regulatory authorities. They already understand the restoration work that you're going to be doing. They approve it. They approve the procedures and all. So there's no having to go back and reinvent the wheel each time on a project. They can just, all we do is we get contacted at the bank. They need, these are their impacts. This is the location of it. They maybe do some sort of a functional or quality assessment of it, and then we just send them a letter saying that we're going to provide them with this many credits. We have them available. They sign a contract that releases them from future liability associated with the mitigation of that project, and boom, that part of the permitting process is more or less complete. So it can be a lot more streamlined versus I've been working about 6 months on a permittee responsible project where we're going to be doing mitigation for a permittee where a bank wasn't an option, and it just takes a considerable more amount of time. So who buys credits from banks? Well, here's some East Texas examples for you. Some projects I've actually done mitigation for, like an Armed Forces Reserve Center, I guess Department of Defense. So they put that in near one of our projects. That was about a 2-acre impact to emergent wetlands. They needed, so we did 3.3 credits on that one. So that's like a commercial development basically. They just couldn't avoid for the footprint they needed to put in, and because of the geographic location was so important for that installation, they just couldn't avoid the wetlands. That they needed to go ahead and impact them. The right side, that's a private lake project I'm working on right now. That's me down there doing a quality survey on that stream because there was a discussion as to was this a high-quality stream or a low-quality stream. So you had to get out there on the ground and assess a few miles of stream to make sure that the mitigation was going to be appropriate for the impact. Oil and natural gas development in East Texas, they're the primary purchaser of mitigation credits. We have the Haynesville Shale here that up until natural gas prices really slumped off was a pretty big consumer of mitigation. And this is just a representative picture I took of what an impact site would look like. That's a compressor station on a pipeline that basically helps move the product downstream. So you have there's all kinds of opportunities for impacts when you're having to put in big work operations pads like this out in the middle of the woods. That's next to a stream. So, I mean, there's a road that has to cross the stream. There's a pipeline crossing the stream. There might be fringe wetlands that have to get filled in. That right there is probably only a 2-acre footprint. But a lot of those projects, and even though the typical project I had there only impacted 1/10 of an acre, it's about 0.3 credits, it adds up real fast when you're talking about putting a well in every 60, 80 acres on the landscape. There's sometimes after the fact permits. The picture I have there is there was a commercial development that had filled in a small amount of wetlands, so someone must have called in and reported a violation, and the Corps comes out and will assess a penalty on top of the required mitigation. The next picture is an airport expansion. There was actually this area right here. I've kind of got my little arrow pointing at it. That was the airport needed to expand a little bit further out and fill in a large amount of wetlands there. And then bridge replacements. Occasionally, DOT agencies will have to do a significant amount of bridge replacements, and that can add up pretty fast too. Both of these were, I think, 15 to 20 credit impacts altogether. This is just a picture of a bridge, but they did a large number of bridges, and it added up pretty quick. Kind of switching gears just to talk about when you're developing a restoration project or a banking project. You have to take into account all the different risks, but there's kind of a new a risk that doesn't usually come up on other projects, and that's regulatory risk. I have another slide about that, but when I talk about regulatory risk, kind of talking about the consistency or the variability between different regulatory administrative districts or units that kind of across the landscape. And each of these districts kind of has different levels of experience on doing these projects. Some might have been involved with kind of paving the way for these markets for wetland and stream mitigation, whereas others might just now be learning about it. And that can really impact the amount of time that it takes to get a project approved and get it to where it can start generating revenue, or it could impact just kind of your whole assumptions of the project going into it. Sometimes what you might perceive as a good project, or what may be a good project in one part of the country, just may not fit the cut in another part of the country in terms of restoration or enhancement, because depending on where you are, the resources that are needing to be protected have been impacted historically to different extents. So where there might be plenty of wetlands or streams in one part of the country that really haven't been impacted that much, in other areas they've been seriously impaired, so they really want to tighten up the kind of restoration that's happening there. They really want, it's critical that restoration is occurring in some parts of the country, whereas other parts of the country there might not be that much restoration to be done. You might just be looking at enhancement of just slightly impaired systems. Then there's individual project risks that are just kind of tied to an individual piece of property. There's always a risk that you fail to meet your ecological or budgetary goals, and then there's always the environmental risk, kind of your acts of God, fires, floods, droughts. We had fires and a lot of drought here last year. You can have an avalanche. I've even heard of a volcano impacting someone's project. Some of those things you just can't plan on. There's financial risks, kind of the inefficiencies associated with your supply and demand analysis, and then credit pricing, your inability to accurately predict what pricing will be in the future, reputational risks associated with the failure of a project, or the risk associated with selling credits for questionable or unpopular projects. And that might be the case when you're starting to get into things like shale gas development and things of that nature. Regulatory risk, just one more slide on that, talking about that could be impacted at the national or local regional levels, national level by program funding. Budget constraints can really limit the amount of personnel a district can have on hand to help process your permit or your potential customers' permits. There's also regulatory and policy changes that may impact your project in the future, new standards or methodologies that make your project non-compliant. The local, regional level, you might lose the people you've been working with for a long time, might have retired, and then you end up working with a new person and trying to rebuild that relationship that you may have established. Enforcement, procedural changes. Enforcement is probably a big issue. I included this figure from the State of Biodiversity Markets report. I believe that's from 2011. The data is from 2008, but just showing that right now mitigation banks and in-lieu fee programs make up about, let's say, 40%, by now probably more of that. So there's a lot of opportunity to, as the new rule in 2008 becomes implemented, to see the percentage that mitigation banks, off-site projects are able to expand and account for more of the mitigation. There's an opportunity there for growth in the industry. But at the same time, there's always going to be the need for permittee responsible mitigation that occurs on-site by the person applying for the permit, because it just might make the most sense ecologically at the end of the day. Example of regulatory risk, we have, here's a project I was working on, or I'm always working on. I live not too far from this project, and we started with the assumption that our service area was going to be the same that it had been the past 3 years in the district, maybe even longer than that, where your service area was determined by ecoregions and also by larger watersheds. So the yellow or the tan there represents what would have been our primary service area, our kind of one-to-one trading area, and then the brown would have been our, what we would call a secondary, where there'd be a 1.5 multiplier. So we had a pretty big service area. Believe it or not, this little watershed I'm pointing at here is probably one of the most highly impacted ongoing impacts of aquatic resources in the state, probably maybe even in most of the South or even the country. There's a lot of surface mining goes on here and a lot of oil and gas development. This is one area where the Haynesville Shale is also coming into, or has come through, and there's a lot of historical oil and gas development. So pretty good place to have a project. But we went through the permitting process, and over time, I guess one point I'd like to make is that as these markets become more robust, and they become more refined, they have a track record, it becomes necessary for regulatory officials to modify certain aspects of the program, and that might be the geographic service area. In this case, they felt like this older way of doing it was just way too much service area for offsetting impacts to aquatic resources. So by the end of the day, totally changed the methodology. We ended up with this little tan area up here in the corner was our primary service area, We had a secondary and then what was called a tertiary. So that just shows how some things can change when you're going through the permitting process that can really impact what you forecast your financial performance to be on that project. Another example of regional variability is the credit methodology you use. This just shows that Charleston method's pretty popular in some parts of the country for assessing wetlands. We have a new assessment method in Texas called TexRAM, and that's in the northern half of Texas. The southern half of Texas still uses this other model. And I ran this on the same hypothetical project just to show you how, depending on the model you use, it's going to give you different kinds of numbers, different metrics that you're going to be using to offset. So it might be like euros, pesos, and dollars. And so anyways, on the landscape, that partially explains why you see, this is another chart from that State of the Markets report, how credit prices around the country can fluctuate. A lot of that's tied to land prices, sure, but a lot of it's also tied to the fact that you might be dealing in totally different kinds of widgets from place to place just because of the assessment tools that are being used. Case study, back to that Burleson project, I had the service area map. So talk about that project. It's acquired in 04, 3,000 acres. It was acquired to be a recreational tract. The forest has been highly impacted over the years by high grading harvest. This project, the revenue streams that were going to come off of it is timber harvesting from just conventional timber management, and also part of the restoration plan. There was a waterfowl habitat improvement grant called the NACA grant that was put on it that increased the recreational value of the property and also just the habitat value. But there was an easement sale to the Forest Legacy Program as part of this project, and then we also, on a majority of the property, we did a wetlands and stream mitigation bank. And there's still considerable opportunities for recreational and limited development on the property if that's what the landowner wished to do. Just a couple pictures of what it looked like beforehand, and more or less what it looks like now still is kind of a lower quality forest, mid-successional, a lot of shade tolerant trees there. A lot of the more desirable trees were removed over the generations. That photo on the right shows where the NACA grant was used. These were old, what we call green tree reservoirs, moist soil management units, where you'd put in these levees back in the 80s, and you would control the water in the forest. It used to be all forested, but as people don't maintain those over time and beavers take control, it ends up killing back all the timber in those. And what they did was they got a grant to go in and reestablish those green tree reservoirs and get them back operational. Just a little map. I'm actually here in Tyler, sitting down here in south side of Tyler. So this project's a little bit away from a larger town. It's about 100,000 people in this town. Along the floodplain of the Sabine River. This river ultimately runs to the south, but in this East Texas here, it runs more or less east to west. And you have a lot of like pipelines and other sorts of development coming in north-south, so it's kind of a good area for having offsetting aquatic resource impacts. Just to show you, when you really dial in and start looking at how this lays out on the landscape, this is actually like a Sabine River Conservation Corridor is what we call it, but all kinds of initiatives. This is this Old Sabine Bottom is our Department of Transportation's mitigation bank, one of the first mitigation banks in the state. And then there's Wildlife Refuge. That's actually an easement refuge by Fish and Wildlife. And then there's a WRP project. The city of Mineola has its own nature preserve, and then we kind of plugged right in there on the end of that. And because of that, that was how we ended up being able to justify the easement sale. It was a pretty valuable, this corridor as it expands, and there's other mitigation banks coming online in this area too, building off of this corridor. So it's pretty impressive to see how all these different markets and initiatives that place a value on ecosystem services are all kind of tying together to accomplish quite a bit in a small geographic area. And then there's just a map of the property here just to show that the easement encompasses the entire property except for a little section right here that was cut out. Half that section's where the NAWCA grant was used to enhance wildlife habitat, and then the other half is where they have just kind of their facilities for managing the property. They have little weekend cabins and all, and that's on a big, nice ridge overlooking the river, just kind of a nice little scenic area there that was left out of the easement. So the rest of it's in the Forest Legacy Program easement, so it can't be subdivided, and it has to be managed in accordance to a specific management plan that has to be approved by the state and federal forest management authorities, and pretty fairly rigorous, but still gives you a lot of opportunity to just manage the property into the future for timber revenues. That's mostly this tan area. Actually did some pine planting here a few months ago, planting pine plantation. And then the rest of this green is wetland, part of the Wetland Mitigation Bank. It's approved last year. Then I'm working on right now is laying in the stream credits over the top of that too, kind of after the fact, since our credit methodology changed in East Texas since we started going through this permitting process. So, and there's more focus on having the stream credits I was talking about earlier. So we're kind of going back in here and then just updating this project, so we'll have that extra revenue generating opportunity. So questions to ask before you develop a project, since not everyone I guess is going to be in it necessarily from an investment standpoint, is what are your goals? Why you want to do this? And kind of how long is your time horizon to accomplish anything? If you're looking at using one of these regulatory markets, you need to think about, well, what's the supply and demand for a given market within this given region? What's my service area going to be? Why do I see the demand? How many other guys are participating in these markets? Is it competitive? That's probably one of the most critical parts. If you're getting that far, that's where I'd really focus in a lot of time. And how clear and efficient is a project approval process? Let's say you're going to do a wetland or stream mitigation bank. How long is it going to take? And that ties into when do I get paid? And then how much is it going to cost to implement? Permitting costs can really take a long time. Some of my friends that are environmental consultants have really, some of them have decided that they just weren't going to work on permitting mitigation banks because it's, unless you're going to work on like a time and materials basis, it can be really hard to understand what the cost and time are going to be up front to permit a project, because it can, sometimes it can go quick, sometimes it can really get drawn out. That really, I'm talking about the time down here, I talk about your due diligence process. It's really critical to unearth anything that might really come up as an issue. If it's some sort of a old easement on the property that might conflict with the objectives of the restoration process, you really need to have a good due diligence process in place ahead of time. Who are the partners you're going to work with? If you're not going to be the one on the ground doing the work, who are the people you're going to hire to do this work on the ground? Can they read the land really well? Because that's critical, is understanding the past land use history for the site and what's the impairment. What are you going to be able to do on the site to rectify that problem, and what's it going to cost to do that? And then that kind of ties into how we ensure adherence to ecological goals. Are the goals you're establishing for that property reasonable if it's going to be in one of these regulatory mitigation banking programs? You just can't reforest every piece of ground, and sometimes restoration isn't appropriate for a specific site. Ultimately, do the payments justify the ecosystem services as a land use? What other management practices are you going to give up? I have another slide coming up, but think about your trade-offs and what other opportunities are there for this tract. And when you encumber it in perpetuity, which is usually about how long some of these things last. What are you giving up? What opportunities? It's really going to diminish the value of your land when you do that, and usually associate a lot of long-term costs, maintenance costs for the project with that land. And after you've done all that, thought about it, think about, is that the best strategy to achieve your goals that you originally set? Sometimes it's not really the case, especially for some smaller landowners. When I say consider the alternatives, this is another project I manage in, let's see, in more southeast Texas. What it was a project we acquired it about 1.5 years ago. It was already permitted Mitigation Bank, and so we got it, and I've been working on it. They put the easement across the entire property, and the mitigation banking instruments also kind of talks about how the management of the different types of the different parts of the property, even though what you're looking at there isn't actually a jurisdictional wetland. This is a wetlands mitigation bank. The instrument says that on the property we can't cut a tree bigger than 18 inches. So even though I wasn't getting any credits associated with this particular acre, all those trees out there, the instrument also says the whole property needs to be converted to pre-settlement conditions. It needs to be a hardwood forest, harvested and planted back into hard mass trees. Well, this probably historically might not have been a hardwood forest, probably was some sort of open pine savanna maybe, since it's kind of on a little hammock in the river bottom. So nevertheless, the folks that were doing the field work might not have totally understood the project either. And so they would go into these stands. This is 24-year-old pine plantation, probably some of the best productivity soil in the southeast United States, and all those trees that are left are bigger than 18 inches. And there's basically, that's about what I would consider a heavy thinning for a pine plantation silvicultural operation. So all you've done is really increase the growth of those pine trees and encourage their crowns to expand and fill out. They've already grown a couple more inches since this picture was taken. And they still went ahead and they planted the hard mass trees underneath. So now when I look at it, I'm thinking, well, I got about $500,000 tied up in timber value, and I probably got about another couple $100,000 tied up potentially if I'd kept going on with it, planting these hardwood trees underneath and not really getting any credit for it. So, and I don't hang on a second. So, you know, you have to go back and rework through all these things, and it takes a lot of time to do that, and a lot of effort on your part and on the regulatory agency you have to work with to even just kind of correct something small like this. Just something small you have to take care of on paper, it could still take a pretty good while. So my closing remarks, what I would say is don't downplay your conventional markets. There's a lot of good opportunities there. Know your land, understand land management. Always consider your alternatives, and don't get in too big of a hurry. These are still growing markets, and don't sign up for more than you have to. And with that, hopefully I'm taking up too much time. If anyone has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Great, thanks so much, Cliff. We'll take about 15 minutes of questions, and just a reminder, we've had plenty pour in the questions box, but for any folks in the audience who haven't chimed in, feel free. We'll do our best to get to them. So I have an early question from Spencer, who's here at Yale, who asks, what's your response to investors when they ask if you can prove that ecosystem services markets, in fact, diversify a portfolio? And is there data proving that these ecosystem services markets have a low correlation to other asset classes?
All I could say there is that you can prove it. I'm not aware of any publication or anything that's in the public domain that you could look at, but conceptually, when you think about it, it does make sense. It is diversified, and it's not totally correlated to some of these other markets. But at the end of the day, some of that's just kind of the proprietary side of what we're working on is kind of explaining some of those things. I hope that helps.
Got it. Yeah, and actually a related question, how do you feel the economic downturn has impacted Working Land's business model or maybe ecosystem service markets in general?
All in all, I feel like, well, certainly from an investment management standpoint, it's a little bit more difficult to raise money right now. But all in all, I mean, the downturn has constricted the regulatory budgets, made it a little bit harder for them to approve projects. But the permitting process usually takes a long time to go through, so what I've seen is a lot of the folks that you're going to typically do business with, they're still moving forward because getting a permit's kind of a multi-year endeavor. But that's, in some regions of the United States, I'm sure it really has impacted the pro formas of a lot of projects. Here in East Texas, I think the biggest impact was the reduction in natural gas prices.
Thanks. Question from Jeffrey online who asks, so if the functionality of a project which has generated a credit that has been used, if that fails through lack of proper management or whatever, who do the regulators go after in that scenario?
They will go after the sponsor of the project, and there's usually a section within each what's called an instrument, but the agreement between the regulatory authority and the sponsor of the project basically states that it's the sponsor's obligation to basically provide the offset in case that project does fail in the future. And there are financial assurances in place maintained by the project in case something like that does happen, especially early in the project's life.
Thanks. I have a question from Patrick who asks if you have any further breakdown of the permittee responsible projects, either by size or type of organization, private, government.
You know, that's a good point. I was going to mention that, is that I'd have to look at that slide again. I was thinking about this when I put that in there. Let me look at that.
Sure.
See, a lot of really big projects are going to end up being permittee responsible projects. And this doesn't, it says suppliers of credits. So I'm not sure if that's like an acreage basis. I'm guessing it would be. I'd have to look into that data a little bit more, but you know, to some extent that doesn't surprise me because a really big public works project, let's say, or a really big, like a mine, surface mines generally do their own mitigation because they have to reclaim the site anyways for other regulatory reasons. So a lot of those really big projects are done permittee responsible and probably to some extent always will be just because of the nature of them. And that's why there's always going to be a little bit of skewing on this pie chart.
Okay, thanks. I have a question from Jason who asks, is carbon finance still a factor in these types of projects, or is it off the table at this point due to lack of legislation, i.e. scale of voluntary markets being too small?
My impression, and that's not really my scope of responsibility in Working Lands, but my impression is that, yeah, without any more legislation, it's kind of not something we really look into too much. I mean, we'll look into it. I mean, certainly it sounds like some of these new markets like California, there's some opportunities there, but when working in the United States, it just hadn't really been something that's had enough legs on it to really run with it for us yet.
Okay. A question from Julia about mitigation banks. Are they reviewed or perhaps audited nationally or regionally? Or I guess how are they reviewed?
Well, the proposals are going to be reviewed regionally, and usually that's, let's say, at like a state level would kind of be at what we would call a district. A district usually is a state. Texas is broken into 3 different districts, but you'll have within the regulatory office of each district, that's where the decisions are made as to, for the most part, what your service areas are going to be, what methods you're going to be using, the assessment methods and all. That's dictated at a regional level. And I'm sure there's occasionally they do put out some like national level reports, kind of like, I wouldn't say an audit, but just kind of some summaries. But all the monitoring and auditing, every couple years they'll come out to a project and get on the ground and really want to see what you've been doing, how it's working out, provide justification. They just spent a couple days last year on one of my projects. We're just going through what all we've been doing, and then we provide just as much substantive justification than what we did, either application logs or invoices, things of that nature, to make sure the work's actually happening.
Thanks. The question online from Georgia, who asks, how are ecosystem changes as a result of climate change accounted for, or are they at all?
I would say not directly in these projects, because unfortunately it's kind of difficult for us to predict. What we do know is it's going to be more uncertain and maybe a little bit more on extremes side of things. So the best we can do right now is just build as healthy of an ecosystem as we can when we're doing our restoration, because that's going to be the one that's going to be most likely to respond and kind of work its way through this stuff. And you know, the kinds of changes we're talking about are occurring over decades to century scale. That's how I think about it, at least.
Okay. How about this question? Would it help if there was a national standardization to the units and service areas for regulatory markets?
For these smaller or more regionally specific markets that I've been talking about today, I do think that what we have right now is we have a rule, the 2008 rule, that's for wetlands and streams, that kind of governs at the national level. Here's some general requirements of everything that's coming and going. But I do see the benefit of, at the regional or the district level, having those folks there, those regulators there, have the discretion to more or less customize the system to meet their regional needs. And because every place is going to be different, and it's going to require a little bit different twist on maybe a more restricted service area, or maybe a larger one, kind of depending on the lay of the land.
Great. Well, I have 5 minutes until the hour, and we've actually covered all the questions that came in from the audience at this point. So I'd like to wrap up and thank Cliff for coming online today and presenting a really interesting standpoint for the conclusion of this series on ecosystem services. We will be wrapping these up, posting them online as soon as possible, and at that point I'll circulate an email to all the folks on this listserv so they can tune back in case you missed any of the additions. And it'll also be available on the Center for Business and the Environment at Yale's website. So with that, that concludes our spring series. Thanks, Cliff, so much for coming on today, and thanks everybody in the audience for joining. Have a good rest of your week and a good weekend. Thanks.
Thank you.